Digital Foundry is proudly sponsored by the Logitech G935 headset.
There was a time when Konami ruled over the gaming landscape, producing some of the finest titles to ever grace arcades and home consoles. It was a wondrous time, but a time long past. Those halcyon days of classic Konami have become little more than a distant, wistful memory in recent days. But lately, there is evidence that something is alive and stirring within the hallways of Konami. Last year, they kicked things off by releasing the two Dracula X titles on the PlayStation 4, Symphony of the Night and Dracula X Rondo of Blood. Then, just a month ago, the first installment in its Arcade Classics line was released, offering a solid mix of arcade titles spanning a decade. And while the collection has its fair share of minor issues, it's great to experience these once again on a modern machine. And today, we have the Castlevania Anniversary Collection. For fans of the series, this collection promises an easy and convenient method to enjoy 8 original Castlevania games on current generation consoles, but impressions from eager buyers noted some potential issues within. So today we're going to check out this collection and see if it does do justice to this great series, while also discussing the legacy of Castlevania. So grab a wine glass, shatter it on the floor, and get ready for some Castlevania. Castlevania has long been a series of two identities. Since the mid-90s, Castlevania games have typically focused on exploration-driven action, in the vein of Metroid. This design helped shape Castlevania into something different, asking players to focus more on character building, backtracking, and exploration. Yet long before Metroidvania became a thing, the series offered something entirely different. Simon's Quest aside, the earlier games in the series focused more on linear progression, through a series of challenging stages. Reach the end of the stage, face off against a boss, and move on. While I love a good Metroidvania, I've always preferred the straightforward action of these earlier titles. There's a deliberate flow to the action in these games. Sure, jumps are rigid, movement is relatively slow, but it's the enemy patterns, level design, and required precision that make for an addictive game. Once you get into the flow, it just feels perfect. Beyond gameplay, Castlevania has gained a reputation for both pushing the visual and especially the musical envelope. The series offers some of the finest video game music ever crafted, and with each new installment, its composers continue to break new ground, both in terms of composition and technical implementation. Sometimes, special chips were designed to enhance audio capabilities of a target system, as was the case with the VRC-6 in the original Japanese version of what would be known as Castlevania Three. Or the remarkably atmospheric tunes of Super Castlevania 4, which rely on Super NES's sample-based hardware to deliver a rich canvas of sound. And now, the classic Castlevania formula is available in this new collection. The Anniversary Collection includes 8 games. The first 3 8-bit NES games, the 2 Game Boy installments, Super Castlevania 4 for Super NES, Castlevania Bloodlines on Sega Genesis, and the Japan-only Kid Dracula released on Famicom. The collection was developed by the brilliant porting studio M2, but does it really live up to their usual high bar? First impressions are certainly positive. The collection opens with a beautiful menu featuring the available games presented in a vertical layout. Currently, the version of this collection available in the West only includes the original Western releases, which means no VRC-6 music for Castlevania 3 and minor censorship in the 16-bit games. Konami has noted, however, that it is planning to patch the Japanese versions into this release, so keep an eye out for that. Open up a game on the list then, and you'll immediately have access to a selection of options to adjust your experience. Each of the console games share the same basic options. By default, games run using a 4:3 aspect ratio with nearest neighbor scaling. This means no interpolation on pixels, which also means shimmering is visible during scrolling, which can prove distracting. The pixel perfect mode, however, solves this by presenting an image with what appears to be a 4x pixel height by a 5x pixel width. The aspect ratio is incorrect, but shimmering is eliminated, and honestly, I prefer using this mode since the difference between this and 4x3 isn't that significant. 16:9 of course stretches the image to fill the entire screen, which is obviously too wide for games like this. Then there are the scanline options, and this is where one of my first complaints comes in. Basically, when using scanlines, the game also forces a bilinear filter on the image, blurring the pixels in the process. There's currently no option for decoupling scanlines and filtering, thus I wouldn't really recommend using them unless you don't mind the additional blur. When playing Game Boy games, however, there is another very cool option available, a dot matrix filter designed to simulate the look of a Game Boy screen. It works surprisingly well and is my preferred method of play for these titles. If you're playing on a Switch in portable mode, however, the options work slightly differently due to the reduction in screen resolution. When playing something like Bloodlines, the pixel perfect mode looks excellent thanks to its 320x224 resolution. It nearly fills the screen and it looks great. But when playing games with a narrow pixel resolution, which includes all the NES games and Super Castlevania 4, the pixel perfect mode presents the games in an 8:7 ratio, which appears rather narrow. This is arguably more correct, some might say, but either way, it's different than when playing in docked mode. The standard 4x3 mode still introduces shimmering, but it's a little less noticeable, and the scanline modes actually look a lot nicer on the small screen. You can adjust the frame around each game as well, including the option to use black bars, which I prefer personally, in addition to the option to load and save your game state. Lastly, there's the replay feature, which allows players to save a session as a replay and view it later, which is kind of a neat bonus. Unfortunately, there are no options to adjust input mappings. I'm using the Switch version here, and for those that prefer using B to jump and Y to attack, this collection reverses the two. Thankfully, A and X are in the order that I prefer and work just as well, plus it's possible to pair a third-party controller like the 8-bit Do M30 with the Switch, which works perfectly. The overall presentation of each game is relatively basic then, but how does the emulation fare? After all, due to the multi-platform nature of these games, M2 needs to emulate 4 different machines. But appreciating these games goes beyond the emulation in this collection, so let us travel back through time by starting with the most recent game in this collection, Castlevania Bloodlines, and appreciate what each game brings to the table. Castlevania Bloodlines was developed by Konami late in the life of the Genesis/Mega Drive, and as you'd expect from the masters at Konami, it takes full advantage of the Mega Drive hardware. There are 6 stages in total, and each stage is packed to the brim with unique visual elements and hardware tricks galore. The first stage is simple enough. Detailed background tile work with multi-layer parallax scrolling and great color usage. The first boss features a segmented design with multiple sprites working in harmony to create super smooth animation. And I also appreciate the PCM audio clip used when you defeat a boss. It sounds suitably chunky, but it's the second stage where things really start to take off. Konami takes full advantage of the system's VDP to deliver some rather unexpected results. The first of these appears right away in Stage 2, the reflective water at sunset. So what's going on here? Well, firstly, foreground layer A and the sprite layer are both mirrored, which gives the impression of a reflection when the scene is assembled. The parallax background, however, works differently, instead changing colors partway down the image. It's a fixed background layer with a baked-in reflection, you could say, but the waterline shifts the palette. Perhaps it's using shadow and highlight or another trick, but either way, it works beautifully. When combined, these elements are drawn in sync, giving the impression of water rising and falling along with the reflections. Then there's this next section, the flood. Water follows the player up through a vertical segment of the stage using a raster trick similar to the Sonic games. From what I understand, the VDP has a register that can trigger a line interrupt, allowing the color palette to shift at the desired point. which in this case gives the impression of transparent water. The boss in Stage 2 is also impressive. A towering figure stands before you, composed of multiple segments that break apart as you attack. Beyond this, there's some other neat tricks awaiting you at later stages. The Leaning Tower, in Stage 3 for instance, looks great and serves as an interesting set piece. Or how about this scene, which looks suitably three-dimensional by using different sized sprites both at a distance and in the foreground to give the impression of platforms moving around the swaying tower. The boss of this stage also uses some cool effects to give the impression of a rotating tower with transparent clouds swirling around you during the fight. Look closely and you'll see that the tower object itself is stationary. The perception of rotation stems exclusively from the sprites themselves. It was a common trick used in other games of this era, and it's very effective here. Or how about this hallway in Stage 5? My best guess is that the developers are using the shadow and highlight modes here to give the impression of beams of light slicing across the scene. And more of these impressive set pieces continue to show up right through the end of the game. It's fair to say that Bloodlines is an impressive technical showpiece for the Mega Drive, and the developers have employed every trick in the book to create some amazing levels. Bloodlines also features a stellar soundtrack composed by Michiru Yamane. This was her first Castlevania score, and it serves as a great jumping off point with a multitude of classic tracks within. So it's a great game, but until now it has remained exclusive to the Mega Drive. Unlike most other games in the series, it was never re-released even on services such as Virtual Console. Therefore, its sudden arrival in this collection is rather welcome. Fans of the series finally have an opportunity to play the game in a more convenient fashion. So, how well is it emulated then? Well, I'm happy to report that M2 has delivered a beautifully emulated rendition of the game. Every visual effect is properly simulated and the sound is excellent. Remember that there's a lot of variability between different Mega Drive consoles too, so it may sound slightly different than what you remember, but it's solid overall. Unless of course you're playing on Xbox One, where there is an audio popping bug present in this game and Castlevania 4, seemingly due to a sample rate mismatch. It should be fixable in a patch, but for now it's perfect on Switch and PS4. Expectedly, there are no visual differences here between the original hardware and the emulated version. In this case, I'm comparing the collection version against an original Japanese Mega Drive connected using RGB to an open source scan converter. The unique stylings of the game have been fully preserved, which is great news all around. As a game, Bloodlines remains one of my favorite in the series, and it's great that M2 was able to do it justice in this collection. But that brings us to our next game, Super Castlevania 4. Released shortly after the launch of the Super NES in North America, Castlevania 4 is kind of a soft reboot of the first 8-bit NES game. This comes at a time before Castlevania had been fully defined, and thus it has a unique atmosphere and visual style that differs from the games that would follow. Up until this point, the series was known for its catchy, upbeat music and contrasty visuals. Castlevania 4, however, leverages the hardware to deliver a game that I would comfortably describe as atmospheric. The world is dark and foreboding, with sprite and tile design quite unlike any other game in the series, and I genuinely appreciate the game's pacing as well. It feels more like a journey as opposed to a series of distinct challenges. You spend a good chunk of the game making your way to Dracula's castle, and the transitions from one stage to the next always feel natural. It's very effective. But what stands out to me the most is its musical score. While there are suitably Castlevania tracks in this game, the bulk of the soundtrack is more atmospheric in nature. Just listen to a few of these examples. It's an interesting approach to music for sure, and one made possible with the system's SPC 700 audio chip. As an early game for the system then, Castlevania 4 also features many of the expected Super NES visual tricks. Famously, Mode 7 makes an appearance at various points throughout the game, from a room that rotates around the player to a long hallway set within a spinning cylinder. At the time, it looked really impressive, and most importantly, it did not interfere with the core gameplay, which is always a concern when utilizing new techniques. It also makes liberal use of color math, often known as transparency. This allows streams and waterfalls to appear properly transparent across the game world. And the color palette itself is rather broad, and there's a great use of parallax scrolling, with multiple planes seemingly scrolling at different intervals, likely using interrupts. One complaint I've always had with this game, however, is the size of the sprites. It looks great, but it's a little bit too large for its own good, and your whip is long enough to cover 1/3 of the screen, which means secondary weapons are less useful, and it's rather easy to take just about anything out. The whip is also completely flexible with multi-directional swinging and a hanging mechanic. It's all very responsive and it does feel good to play, but it also reduces the challenge. Emulation-wise, this is another home run. It looks and runs exactly as it should, and all effects are rendered properly. In addition, audio is great, with a perfect representation of the original SPC tracks. We've seen this game released on other services over the years, but it's nice to have it available in this package as well. But just prior to the release of Super Castlevania and the Super NES itself is the second Game Boy title, Castlevania 2: Belmonts' Revenge. Known as Dracula Densetsu 2 in Japan, this Game Boy sequel is one of my favorite titles on the system. It's a gloriously well-designed action game that feels like a fresh take on the formula, something evident right from the start with its level selection menu. Similar to Mega Man, players can choose from the first 4 stages and play them in any order that they please. You're not granted access to any special power-ups, mind you, but it's a great way to revisit the game on subsequent replays. Each castle has its own unique theme and different types of challenges. The platforming is always precise and rigid, but it still feels great to play. And technically, this is a top-tier Game Boy game as well. While slow-paced, the sprite work is solid and the proportions are just perfect. Sprites are neither too large or too small. It's the right size for a game on Game Boy. In addition, the background art is beautiful for the system and it really holds up. But more than anything else, it's the music that really stands out to me, as is becoming kind of a theme with Castlevania. Belmonts' Revenge features a remarkably catchy soundtrack with tunes that stand toe-to-toe with the best in the series. It's an entirely original score too, just listen to some of these tracks. Great stuff, right? Another fascinating thing about many Game Boy games, including Castlevania 2, is the prevalence of right angles. You'll notice that Belmonts' Revenge uses ropes rather than the traditional Castlevania steps, right? It uses them well, but I believe that this design choice was made to save on cartridge memory. M2 thankfully got the emulation just right as well. The dot matrix filter looks great and the games are reproduced perfectly. Well, mostly. Take this stage. On the Game Boy hardware, the developers opted to flicker the distant mountains on and off every frame. Due to the poor quality LCD, however, this flickering gives a persistent impression of a slightly different shade in the background compared to the foreground. If I slow down the game speed here, you can see what I'm talking about. In the collection, however, this flicker has been removed entirely. Now the background art has a rather uniform appearance. Still, this is a great game, and it's great on this collection. The next title then is a little different. It's Kid Dracula, or more precisely, Akumajo's special, Boku Dracula-kun. This is a cute take on the Castlevania formula with its own spin. The gameplay is slightly faster and less rigid, and Dracula yields magic instead of a whip. Thus, the whole design of the stages differs due to the change in attack style. In bringing the game to this collection then, Konami went so far as to properly localize it. It features a new title screen with English text throughout, which is fantastic. It's not often you see a proper translation of a classic game like this, but here we are. There are even some changes made to the content, as you'd expect. This first boss here, sporting a robe with the manji symbol on it, has obviously been changed, just as it was when the Game Boy pseudo-sequel was released around the world back in 1993. Hey, why didn't they include that version as well? Unlike the slightly older third game released on Famicom, however, this does not make use of the advanced VRC6 mapper chip, instead relying on the VRC4. Thus, you don't gain any extra sound channels over a stock system. Emulation is expectedly great then. It looks and plays just right in this collection, and it's great to have an official version on hand. Next up is Castlevania 3, arguably the finest of the 8-bit trilogy. Released in North America in 1990, Castlevania 3 is a slightly downgraded localization of the Japanese Akumajo Densetsu. I've already demonstrated the difference in audio earlier in the video, and that is indeed the biggest difference between the two. In the US and Europe, the VRC6 was replaced with Nintendo's own MMC5 mapper, and the game is mostly identical save for some slight censorship and changes to the color palette. No matter which version you play, however, it's a fantastic and very challenging Castlevania game. There are a ton of stages here, and players are even offered a choice between many of them, allowing you to alter your path to the end. Stages are huge, with a mix of horizontal and vertical scrolling. There's a great use of shadow in the artwork as well, with a heavy contrast between different portions of the screen. It looks great in general, though there are some areas that I feel look a little garbled as a result of the tile arrangement. Still, it certainly feels like a late generation title for the system. Emulation in this collection then is spot on as well. It looks and sounds pitch perfect. Of course, there's also the Japanese release to look forward to, which Konami is planning to patch into this collection at a later date. The other Castlevania game released in 1989, however, is not quite as successful. Castlevania the Adventure. This was launched just a few months after the Game Boy and represents one of Konami's first attempts at delivering a full-blown action game on a portable machine. Unfortunately, it's clear that the developers didn't really have a handle on the hardware just yet. The game runs extremely slowly and is a chore to play as a result. Unlike most titles on the system, 60 frames per second is not fully achieved, and surprisingly, there's also screen tearing, something you almost never see from games of this era. As a result, the whole thing just feels jerky and sluggish to play. The soundtrack is killer and it looks nice visually, but game speed is a real issue here and it just doesn't work that well. And unfortunately, this is one case where accurate emulation isn't necessarily the best option. More than any other game in this collection, the Adventure would really benefit from a revision designed to eliminate technical problems. Still, I had this game when I was younger and have a soft spot for it, but honestly, unlike its sequel, it doesn't really hold up that well. I do appreciate its inclusion, however, and kinda wish Konami and M2 had gone even further and included more games. We're nearing the beginning of the NES timeline though, which brings us to one of the more controversial games in the series, Castlevania 2: Simon's Quest. And this one is a strange beast indeed. First released in Japan on the Famicom Disk System, it was converted for Western release to the cartridge format, with some changes along the way. The loss of an extra audio channel available to the disk system means that the soundtrack had to be reworked, In addition, the save feature available in the disk system version was removed. On the positive side, the NES version lacks loading screens between different areas. Castlevania 2 is a game I'm not necessarily a big fan of, however. It's the first in the series to offer a less linear experience though, and in a way it's kind of the precursor to Symphony of the Night. So in that sense it's an important release even if it doesn't hold up that well. The poor translation and sometimes strange game design quirks really make for a rocky ride. But once again, emulation is handled properly and it plays exactly as you'd expect. As a piece of history, it's great to include in this collection, but it's difficult to get into. At last we come to the final game in this collection, and the game that kicked off the series for most people. The original Castlevania first appeared in Japan as Akumajo Dracula for the Famicom Disk System and was later released on cartridge in the West, while also receiving a Famicom cartridge release years down the road. The primary difference between the disc version and the cart version is the lack of saving on the cart, but otherwise they're mostly identical save for a few minor changes here and there and some bug fixes. It's still a great game today, but this is the one title included in the collection which has some technical issues to consider. Firstly, there's the sound bugs. During certain stages, you'll encounter a high-pitched beeping noise playing back at a regular interval. Take a listen. It's distracting and inaccurate, a rather strange thing indeed. Secondly, the version included in this collection is the original Revision 0 cart rather than the Revision 1 release. This is an issue as the Revision 0 version includes a couple bugs, including a nasty crash bug that occurs late in the game when too many sprites appear on screen. There are other bugs in the cart version as well. If you watch the first two Attract demos, then skip the third one, you'll start the game with no music at all, at least until a boss appears or you die. Basically, while the emulation here is mostly fine, save for the sound glitches, they kinda picked the worst revision of the game to include in this package. Hopefully it can be patched out and the Revision 1 game patched in instead. So there we have it, 8 Castlevania games presented for your pleasure. I may not have been able to go into extreme depth on each title, but hopefully you've gained a better appreciation for what they achieved for the time. The edges may be rough on certain games, but each title brings a unique angle to the table. This period of time represents an era when Castlevania had not yet been completely defined by Konami itself. It was experimental, and most of all, it was fun. But that's all from me for the moment. If you enjoyed this trip through the world of Castlevania, be sure to like and subscribe, ring the notification bell at the top there, and follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, stay retro.
Featuring 2.4 GHz wireless, 50mm Pro G audio drivers, and DTS Headphone X 2.0 surround sound technology under the hood, the G935 headset delivers the ultimate wireless audio solution for gamers, whether you're playing on PC, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, or mobile. Order yours today from Logitech G.